The logical problem of evil has been a hot topic of discussion amongst philosophers for a long time. Lately, it has resurfaced in online skeptical communities, specifically critiquing the compatibility between an all-good, all-powerful God and the existence of true evil. Evils that, all things considered, should not exist. Proponents of this argument suggest that if theistic explanations justify every evil as somehow necessary, this undermines the very concept of true evil and suggests a logical contradiction within theistic belief. Theists must recognize that this is a serious philosophical issue that has influenced both academic and public discourse for centuries. Philosophers like J.L. Mackie have argued that the existence of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God logically contradicts the presence of evil. Today's formulation explores whether the traditional theistic view can accommodate seemingly gratuitous evils without contradiction. Our response will explore several angles. We will steelman the argument to appreciate its strengths, then assess whether it effectively addresses theistic beliefs by evaluating its assumptions and limitations. Then we will examine the flexibility in theistic ethical frameworks, the role of God's purposes in relation to evil, and how various philosophical objections challenge the argument's conclusions. By the end of this video, our goal is to offer a balanced perspective on the logical problem of evil and to encourage further consideration of the nuanced challenges within this enduring debate. First off, to properly assess the argument, it's important to clarify the specific definitions that proponents of this argument use for key terms, as these definitions shape the assumptions and conclusions of their position. It's worth noting that these definitions reflect how proponents of this argument frame these concepts and aren't necessarily definitions that all theists must accept, or for that matter, how different proponents of the argument must use the terms. This is just targeting the most used formulation that I have found thus far. First is the phrase true evil. Proponents of this argument define true evil as events that, all things considered, should not occur under any circumstances. According to this view, true evil goes beyond merely unfortunate or harmful events. It is an event that lacks any morally sufficient reason for its existence, even when considering a broader good. This interpretation of true evil suggests that an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God would prevent any such occurrences. In my estimation, true evil seems to be synonymous with what other philosophers would call gratuitous suffering, suffering that is just not necessary for any greater good. Next, proponents of this argument distinguish between two types of explanations, narrative and normative. Narrative explanations describe the causal background of an event, how it occurred, while normative explanations address why it should or should not occur. This distinction is important because proponents see theodicies as normative explanations aiming to morally justify evil within a theistic framework. Next, we have the word theodicy. In this framework, a theodicy is considered a type of normative explanation, not only explaining why an event happens, but justifying why it should happen. The skeptic will argue that if theodicies justify each instance of evil, it implies that every evil has a moral purpose, effectively denying the existence of true evil as defined previously. Next is omnibenevolence. The argument presumes that an omnibenevolent or all-good God would have a strong moral commitment to preventing all forms of true evil. In this view, God's moral perfection would mean an inherent opposition to any instance of gratuitous evil, as permitting such evil would conflict with his nature. And lastly, we have pro toto evil. This term describes evil in a pro toto or all things considered sense. For proponents of this argument, pro toto evil implies that any evil event allowed by God must be fully justified in the total scope of divine purposes. If any evil is ultimately justifiable within this pro toto framework, it would not qualify as truly gratuitous or unjustifiable, and therefore would not meet their criteria for any true evil. With that out of the way, now let's steelman the argument. Before moving to our critique, let's present the argument in its strongest possible form, giving a fair and thorough representation of the proponents of this argument's position. This argument aims to highlight an apparent logical inconsistency within theistic belief, when it comes to reconciling the existence of true evil with the attributes of an omnibenevolent and omnipotent and omniscient God. Proponents argue that the presence of true evil, events that, all things considered, should not happen, poses a direct challenge to classical theism. The reasoning is as follows. Theodicies as normative justifications. Proponents claim that traditional theodicies, which attempt to explain why God allows evil, are not merely causal or explanatory in nature. Rather, they serve as a normative justification, providing reasons why specific evils should occur, given the greater goods they supposedly produce. In this view, if God has a morally sufficient reason for every evil, then each evil event becomes justified as necessary or even good within the broader moral framework, contradicting the idea of true evil. Next is the dilemma between God's attributes and the existence of evil. At the core of this argument is a dilemma for the theist. The proponents argue that if God is genuinely omnibenevolent, he would prevent all forms of true evil, as allowing any instance of it would be incompatible with his nature. Conversely, if God permits evil but has morally sufficient reasons for doing so, then those evils cannot be considered true evil, but are instead morally justified as components of the best possible world, given God's purposes. 3 is the collapse of pro toto evil into justified evil. The proponents of this argument claim that, under classical theism, all evils must be pro toto fully justified within the total view of God's purposes. If every evil can be explained as pro toto evil, then it cannot be considered truly gratuitous or purposeless. Thus, the concept of true evil is systematically eliminated under this view, forcing the theist to either redefine God's attributes or reject the existence of true evil altogether. So here is the logical progression of the argument. Premise 1, if God exists, he possesses the attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Premise 2, an omnibenevolent God would prevent all instances of true evil, again, evils that should not occur under any circumstances. Premise 3, true evil exists in the world, events that, all things considered, ought not occur. Premise 4, if God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing all evil, then no evil is truly gratuitous. It must serve a greater good and thus cannot be considered true evil. Conclusion, therefore, either true evil does not exist, contradicting common human experience, moral intuitions, and Christian theology through sin, or God is not omnibenevolent, omniscient, or omnipotent, which would challenge the classical theistic conception of God. With the argument thus presented, we'll move into a critique that examines whether these assumptions and conclusions hold up, particularly in light of alternative theistic frameworks and considerations. Now, it's worth noting that this argument is rhetorically targeting a specific model of God, that is classical theism. There are many other models of God out there that this argument can interact with in many different ways, and some models of God that this argument doesn't touch at all. But because classical theism is the rhetorical target of this argument, I will just be assuming a classical theistic framework moving forward. Now we can finally assess some of the core assumptions this argument makes, particularly around what a perfectly good and powerful God would necessarily do in relation to evil. This in turn gives us many objections we can make to this argument. Objection 1 is the assumption of the necessity condition. The proponents of this argument base their critique on something called the necessity condition, the idea that for God to permit evil, every instance of evil must be absolutely necessary for a greater good. This condition assumes that if God is both all-powerful and all-good, he would permit only those evils that are indispensable to achieving the best possible outcome, thus necessitating that each evil have a specific, indispensable purpose. The necessity condition presupposes a model of divine action that is overly rigid and deterministic, imposing limitations on God's allowance of evil that are not essential to classical theism. A philosophically coherent alternative to the necessity condition is the defeat condition, which allows for a more nuanced understanding of God's permission of evil. Now, before explicating this further, we need to cover an important distinction between protological and eschatological states. A protological state refers to the beginning or present state in which certain experiences like suffering, hardship, and failure appear intrinsically negative or even bad on the whole. These initial states, often filled with disvalue, reflect the reality of human suffering and the loss that characterizes our immediate experience. By contrast, in the eschatological or ultimate state, all evils are ultimately defeated within God's redemptive purposes. The defeat condition, therefore, does not require that each instance of disvalue in the protological state be necessary or directly justified. Rather, it holds that such evils are rendered meaningful or transformed in the eschatological state, aligning with the divine purpose for creation. If we view divine goodness through this lens, the defeat condition allows God's ultimate goodness to operate in ways that preserve human freedom, moral agency, and virtue development, ensuring that each evil, though not strictly necessary, is ultimately defeated and redeemed. Now, because this video is not meant to be a total explication on what the defeat condition is, you can look forward to that in a forthcoming video. But for now, here's a brief treatment on the defeat condition, so that way we have an understanding moving forward. One way to conceptualize the defeat condition is that it does not require every instance of disvalue or suffering to serve an indispensable role in achieving a greater good. Instead, it allows God to permit certain evils as long as they are ultimately defeated, or at least capable of being defeated, within the overarching moral and redemptive narrative of creation. This distinction depends on two related but distinct interpretations of the defeat condition. One is the universal defeat condition. In this view, every instance of disvalue is ultimately redeemed, transformed, or rendered meaningful in the eschatological state, aligning all aspects of creation with divine goodness. Alternatively, we just have the weaker possibility of defeat, where this version of the defeat condition allows that, while not all disvalue must be defeated, each instance must at least be defeasible, that is, capable of redemption or transformation if aligned with God's justice. This view accommodates scenarios where some individuals or experiences may not be fully reconciled in the eschatological sense, such as in cases involving irrevocable rejection of God. Simply put, for an evil to be defeated means that its existence does not result in a permanent, ultimate detriment to God's creation, but is either ultimately overcome, redeemed, or transformed within a broader framework of good. And under the defeat condition, this can mean that all disvalue is either rendered temporary, outweighed, or transformed in the eschatological state, or that each instance of disvalue is at least capable of defeat within God's purposes, allowing room for irrevocable choices while upholding divine justice. Through the defeat condition, we see that divine goodness does not require every instance of suffering to play an immediate, indispensable role, but instead allows for a broader framework where each instance can ultimately be defeated, transformed, or redeemed. And this serves as an undercutting defeater to the skeptic's argument. And this is done by challenging the assumption that strict necessity is essential for a morally good God, and by demonstrating an alternative path to moral justifiability, one centered on the ultimate defeat of suffering. The defeat condition weakens the skeptic's case against theistic beliefs about suffering and divine goodness. With assumption and consequently objection 1 addressed, we now turn to a closely related but distinct claim: the idea that every instance of suffering must serve a specific, identifiable role to be morally justified. While objection 1 challenges the broader framework of the defeat condition, questioning whether any evil without necessity would be incompatible with divine goodness, the next assumption narrows in on the specificity of that purpose. It claims that suffering is only justified if each instance has a unique, indispensable purpose in God's plan. So objection 2 takes the necessity condition further, and it claims that for suffering to be morally justified, each instance must serve a specific, identifiable role in God's plan. And this assumption implies that a morally perfect God could only allow suffering if each instance has a distinct, indispensable purpose within the grand design. However, this role-specific requirement imposes an overly rigid and mechanistic view of divine action, suggesting that every hardship must have an isolated, transactional purpose to be morally justified. Here's an example to help illustrate why this assumption is unnecessary. Consider a parent teaching their child to ride a bike. At times, a parent may allow their child to fall, not because each fall serves a unique or necessary purpose, but because the process of learning to ride includes occasional falls. But it doesn't have to. The parent isn't omniscient or omnipotent like God, yet they allow this suffering, trusting that it won't be irredeemable and that some good may come from it, such as resilience or increased confidence. In this light, the defeat condition posits that divine moral justification may not demand a specific purpose for each instance of suffering. Instead, it upholds that suffering can be part of a broader narrative in which every experienced, even hardship, is ultimately redeemed and transformed within God's purposes. Just as a parent's loving intention is not undermined by a child's fall, God's goodness does not require that each instance of suffering be necessary in isolation, but rather, in the end, every hardship can be reconciled and made meaningful within the divine plan. With Assumption 2 addressed, we can now see that not every instance of suffering must serve an isolated, indispensable purpose to be morally justified. And this brings us to Assumption 3 in the argument, which builds on prior assumptions by challenging the possibility that God might have overriding motivations to permit suffering beyond immediate or specific purposes. Assumption 3 argues that if God is truly all good and all powerful, he would prevent any evil that doesn't serve a clear, overarching goal. However, this assumption may place unnecessary constraints on divine freedom, potentially disregarding the value of a dynamic relationship between God, creation, and human freedom. So in short, Assumption 3 builds on previous arguments by suggesting that if God is truly all good and all powerful, he would prevent any evil that doesn't serve a clear, overarching goal. This view, again, assumes that God's actions should strictly align with a necessity-driven morality, where any evil allowed must be counterbalanced by an immediate and compelling purpose. However, this perspective may place undue constraints on divine freedom, neglecting the possibility that God might permit suffering as part of an overarching relational design with motivations that extend beyond immediate outcomes. For example, a morally perfect God may have motivations that aren't confined to specific purposes for each instance of suffering. Just as a parent's motivations for allowing challenges in a child's life may include nurturing resilience, maturity, and the deepening of a relationship, so too might God allow certain evils within the broader aim of creating a world that fosters freedom, love, and personal growth. These values may not always manifest as immediate goods, yet they contribute to an overarching goal that aligns with divine goodness. For example, God's overriding motivation could be to foster a world where genuine love, free will, and potential for growth are possible. This world, though it includes suffering, allows for a dynamic relationship between God and human beings where individuals participate freely in the unfolding of their lives. In this framework, God's allowance of suffering can be morally justifiable because it supports a world of relational freedom and meaningful personal development, rather than limiting each act of divine permission to a strict transactional necessity. This assumption also imposes a limitation on divine action by assuming God's motivations must always be necessity-based rather than relationally or teleologically oriented. Yet, relational value, such as deepening love, trust, or freedom, often doesn't operate on a need-based framework, but rather on an invitation to participate in something meaningful. By creating a world where relationships with himself and with others can grow, God allows certain experiences that might otherwise be seen as unnecessary. These experiences hold relational value that isn't captured by an immediate, purpose-specific model of justification, but aligns with a broader narrative of growth and ultimate redemption. In this view, divine motivations may include the desire to create a world in which suffering is not strictly necessary, but can lead to ultimate goods, such as the deepening of love or the formation of virtue. And this framework challenges Assumption 3 by suggesting that divine morality encompasses relational aims, not merely necessity-based actions. Having addressed Assumption 3, now let us move to Assumption 4, the idea that a morally good God would eliminate all pro toto evils, those evils that, all things considered, ought not happen because they are not necessary for some greater good. But here is one of the problems. The concept of a pro toto evil is theoretically constrained by the framework in which it's defined, yet its specific content, meaning what would actually count as a pro toto evil, remains unclear and largely ambiguous. This is because in the necessity condition, a pro toto evil would be one that is neither required nor justified in achieving the best possible outcome, meaning that it should not exist in any scenario as its presence would undermine divine goodness. However, in the defeat condition, a pro toto evil would imply an irredeemable, indefeasible instance of suffering that lies outside any redemptive or reconciliatory arc. According to the defeat condition, however, no such evil ultimately exists. All evils are either defeasible or can be transformed within God's redemptive purposes. And this lack of clarity around what precisely constitutes a pro toto evil in a defeat-based framework presents a fundamental issue. For one, the unclear content of pro toto evils is the first issue. While the defeat condition posits that no evil remains irredeemable in the ultimate scheme, the concept of a pro toto evil, something that would be irredeemably bad on the whole, lacks a clear content in both the necessity and defeat frameworks. What exactly would qualify as a pro toto evil given the theistic frameworks envision each evil as defeasible, if not in an immediate isolation, then within an overarching redemptive plan? In other words, if divine goodness guarantees that all evil is ultimately defeasible, can we even coherently posit what a pro toto evil would look like in such a system? Next, pro toto evils are a hypothetical construct. The notion of pro toto evils may be theoretically conceivable but practically unfounded in theistic thought. A hypothetical pro toto evil under the defeat condition would be an evil whose existence is incompatible with any redemptive or reconciliatory purpose. However, without a clear understanding of what such an evil would entail or how it could exist outside of a redemptive context, the concept remains abstract and largely theoretical, with no concrete instantiation within the theistic model. And third, there are limits of conceptualization. This raises a further challenge for the skeptic's argument. By relying on the concept of pro toto evils, the skeptic is, in a sense, requiring the theist to justify why something would or wouldn't exist without clearly specifying what it would mean for a pro toto evil to exist. If divine goodness entails ultimate defeasibility for all evils, then the skeptic's insistence on pro toto evils becomes less of a genuine possibility and more of an intellectual exercise without substantial grounding in the theistic framework. Next, the defeat condition posits that no evil remains permanently irredeemable within the scope of divine action, rather than requiring that every evil serve a necessary purpose. The defeat condition allows for evils that, while not essential for a greater good, are ultimately defeated and reconciled within an eschatological narrative. And by this logic, pro toto evils as irredeemable or untransformed instances of suffering do not exist in a world governed by divine goodness. Every instance of suffering, no matter how severe, has the potential to be redeemed or overcome within God's ultimate design. For instance, take the concept of existential defeat, that proposes that even profound instances of suffering do not undermine the intrinsic worth of a life. For lives marked by suffering that may appear bad on the whole, protologically, existential defeat offers a redemptive process where such disvalue is ultimately transformed, redeemed, or defeated, and under this view, no evil remains pro toto or irredeemably negative within God's plan. Which leads to the last point in this section, which is retroactive consent and reconciliation. This assumption overlooks the possibility of retroactive consent, where individuals might ultimately endorse their life experiences upon seeing the complete arc of their existence within God's redemptive plan. Through an eternal eschatological perspective, they may come to recognize the intrinsic value and meaning of their journey, even if it involved suffering. And this consent provides a profound form of reconciliation, suggesting that no experience remains irreparably fractured or purposeless within the divine order. In this view, Assumption 4 is challenged by recognizing that pro toto evils are not a necessary feature of reality within a theistic framework, where every life is ultimately reconciled, every experience is potentially redeemable, and divine goodness encompasses a process of transformation that goes beyond immediate visible outcomes. Next is Assumption 5, and consequently our fifth objection. It seems an implicit assumption in the argument is that a morally perfect God would create a fully complete, perfect world from the outset, avoiding any initial stages containing disvalue. And this view implies that God would pick and choose only those elements that maximize goodness, entirely excluding disvalue. However, an alternative model, the disjunctive creation model, provides a compelling counterpoint. Rather than seeing creation as a pick and choose operation, this model envisions God creating the world in stages, with each initial segment contributing to an overarching redemptive narrative. The pick and choose approach presumes that God would actualize only specific isolated states of affairs that are perfectly valuable while excluding all forms of disvalue, and by contrast, the disjunctive creation model suggests that God actualizes a general type of world, a world containing rational moral agents, rather than pre-selecting every individual state. And this model allows for an unfolding of reality in which creatures exercise genuine freedom and shape their lives in meaningful ways, being co-creators and co-instantiators of the world with God. This is where modal constraints in the logical space of creation needs to be taken into account. The distinction between these two models hinges on modal reasoning. The pick and choose model assumes that God could actualize a perfect world where every detail aligns with immediate goodness, and however, this assumption overlooks the logical constraints on creating a world with free creatures. Disjunctive creation suggests that God's act of creation respects these constraints by initiating a type of world compatible with free agency, and this approach allows for a world of open possibilities where creatures contribute to the unfolding of reality within God's intentions rather than living in a static predefined framework. Next are the divine obligations following creation. In this context, a deontic framework refers to a system of moral obligations or duties. Applying deontic logic to world creation, we recognize that God's obligations are not intrinsic to the act of creating itself, but arise relationally once creation exists. This means that God is not obligated to create in any specific way. Rather, his moral obligations begin only after he has brought beings into existence. From this point onward, God's duty is to ensure each being's well-being in a way that fulfills their inherent potential, ensuring they are good on the whole according to their nature. And so within this relational model, God's moral justification does not hinge on preemptively eliminating every instance of disvalue. Instead, it rests on guiding each created being toward its ultimate good, enabling redemption and fulfillment. In this post-creation obligation aligns with both strong and weak interpretations of the defeat condition, ensuring that any disvalue is ultimately defeated or made redeemable within the created being's journey. So these initial segments are part of a teleological process. Within this model, initial segments are part of a dynamic journey toward eschatological fulfillment, and these stages might contain imperfections or temporary disvalue, but they are integral to a teleological ordered world, where beings can grow and freely participate in a meaningful divine narrative. And the presence of disvalue in these segments is not contrary to divine goodness, but rather supports a richer relational and developmental reality, leading to the ultimate reconciliation and redemption of creation. Thus, each stage contributes to a purposeful journey, one where divine goodness is achieved through growth and transformation rather than static perfection. This is where the defeat condition and eschatological redemption come in. The defeat condition aligns with this disjunctive creation model by positing that no disvalue in these initial segments are irredeemable. Instead, each phase, if it includes hardship, contributes to an ultimate teleologically grounded good. In this process-oriented view, God's moral justification does not hinge on excluding all disvalue from the outset, but on ensuring that every disvalue is eventually reconciled and redeemed. Next, we turn to Objection 6. A fundamental flaw in the argument lies in its failure to distinguish between intrinsic and instrumental or pro tanto goods. And this oversight leads to a misunderstanding of how certain evils may be permitted by a morally perfect God within a theistic framework. In theistic axiology, intrinsic value refers to something valuable in itself, independent of its consequences, whereas instrumental value or pro tanto value refers to something valuable because of its role in achieving a broader ultimate purpose. This distinction allows for a nuanced view where some evils may be intrinsically bad but serve instrumental roles within the divine narrative. The argument implies that if an evil is necessary for a greater good, it must be pro toto good, justified all things considered, rather than merely instrumentally valuable. And this position assumes that God's allowance of evil requires every evil to be not only justified within the context of an ultimate good, but also intrinsically or inherently good. However, most theistic frameworks maintain that intrinsic disvalue of suffering or evil does not vanish simply because these evils serve a greater purpose. Rather, an evil may remain intrinsically undesirable or bad even as it fulfills an instrumental purpose in the broader narrative of redemption. The skeptic might argue that if a pro toto justification for permitting evil is needed, then instrumental or pro tanto goods cannot apply, so they might assert the following. Instrumental evils by definition only ought to occur for some other end, making it contradictory to say that a pro toto evil is merely instrumental. Non-normative goods do not guide divine action because they are descriptions rather than prescriptions. The skeptic might contend then that pro tanto evils, those tolerated for a specific end, might be permissible for limited agents but would not apply to an all-powerful, morally perfect God. For instance, while humans tolerate a painful injection, a pro tanto evil, to achieve immunity, God, having no such limitations, would not need to tolerate evil for any instrumental good. In response to this anticipated objection, in theistic axiology, this approach actually targets an axiological stance that theistic frameworks do not endorse. Within theistic views, evils are again often seen as defeasible, and they can remain intrinsically undesirable while serving an instrumental purpose in the divine order. A first-order evil like fear, for example, can serve a second-order good like courage without requiring that fear itself be intrinsically good. This coexistence of intrinsic badness and instrumental value is central to theistic responses to the problem of evil and allows God to permit certain evils without needing to redefine them as pro toto goods. And this framework undercuts the argument's premise that an omnipotent being must only allow evils that are pro toto justified. The concept of defeasible evils instead suggests that certain evils are permitted within a relational developmental world where their full justification lies not in their intrinsic nature, but in their ultimate transformation or defeat within God's eschatological plan. Thus, while certain evils are not strictly necessary, they are permitted for the instrumental role they play in the divine narrative, consistent with a coherent view of divine goodness. Additionally, the argument fails as an internal critique by assuming an axiological perspective more aligned with consequentialist or hedonistic frameworks rather than theistic ones. While a hedonistic framework might prioritize pleasure as the highest good, theistic worldviews place God as the ultimate good, with divine goodness encompassing a framework where intrinsic and instrumental values are contextually integrated. And for the argument to hold as an internal critique, it must address these specific axiological commitments rather than imposing external assumptions that theistic frameworks do not share. This leads to the seventh objection, which is related to the last one. A core issue in the skeptic's argument is an equivocation on the term evil. The skeptic seems to be conflating pro toto evils, evils that ought not occur all things considered, with instrumental or pro tanto evils that, while intrinsically undesirable, may serve a role in a larger purposeful narrative. And this conflation suggests that all evils must be irredeemably negative and incompatible with divine goodness, overlooking the theistic view that some evils have instrumental value or are defeasible within a redemptive ultimate purpose. To understand this equivocation, it's essential to distinguish between intrinsic value and intrinsic normativity. Intrinsic value refers to something's inherent desirability or undesirability, such as pain being intrinsically negative. Intrinsic normativity, however, implies that something ought or ought not to happen in every context. An event or state can have intrinsic value, it's bad in of itself, but not carry intrinsic normativity. It doesn't necessarily need to be prevented in every context. The role of intrinsic value in ethical systems is to contribute contextually to our ethical deliberations without providing an absolute formulaic answer in every case. The demand for computational tractability, an exact algorithm for deciding moral value based solely on intrinsic value, sets an unrealistically high bar for ethical theory, given the varied significance of intrinsic value across different contexts. Thus, intrinsic disvalues, like suffering, can hold situational relevance within a theistic framework without mandating an absolute moral ought-not status in every context. In theistic ethics, then, many intrinsic disvalues are tolerated because they contribute to a broader goods, and by treating all evils as intrinsically normative, the skeptic restricts the theistic perspective, which recognizes that some evils are defeasible or redeemable in the grander scheme without requiring they be intrinsically good. Consider the pain of vaccination. The injection of a vaccine is inherently unpleasant. Few people enjoy needles. However, the short-term pain serves as an instrumental purpose by strengthening the immune system. Here, the pain is intrinsically bad. We don't desire it in of itself, but it's not intrinsically normative that this pain should be avoided if it leads to a greater good. Similarly, in a theistic framework, some evils, while intrinsically undesirable, serve a role that ultimately contributes to a greater good and thus aren't necessarily pro toto evil. Let's connect the dots here. The skeptic's definition of true evil as something that ought not to occur, all things considered, implies that any evil occurring in the world would be inherently incompatible with divine goodness. However, this ignores the fact that within many theistic frameworks, that intrinsic disvalue does not imply normativity. The existence of an intrinsic disvalue, like pain or loss, does not entail that it must be prevented if it serves as an instrumental or transformative role, and it ignores the flexibility of moral value in theism. Theistic ethics often distinguish between what is intrinsically undesirable and what is ultimately unjustifiable. This framework allows then for certain evils to have a role in a broader redemptive story, so these evils need not always be intrinsically normative in a pro toto sense, because the skeptic's argument equates intrinsic disvalue with an absolute irredeemable moral status. It misrepresents how theism handles the nature of evil. In short, the skeptic's argument assumes a strict definition of true evil that does not account for the theistic distinctions between types of value and normativity. As a result, this equivocation undermines the argument's conclusion, as it restricts the theistic view in a way that does not align with many philosophical or theological understandings of evil, and this misalignment demonstrates that the skeptic's conclusion, assuming divine incompatibility with any permitted evil, does not logically follow from its premises that conflate distinct aspects of moral value. One last honorable mention is the importance of a teleological arc. An additional concern is that the skeptic's argument overlooks the teleological arc within theistic views. The idea that certain evils, while intrinsically undesirable, may play essential roles in a purposeful narrative directed towards an ultimate good. And from this perspective, some evils are defeasible in that their negative value is ultimately overcome by their role in achieving a higher purpose. And thus, theistic ethics does not require that all instances of evil be justified immediately in isolation, but rather that they contribute meaningfully within the broader divine plan. The distinction here between an evil that lacks a teleological arc and one that possesses one is crucial. An evil that lacks teleological arc, that is, an evil without any role in achieving a greater good or serving a redemptive purpose, would align with the skeptic's notion of true evil, an event that possesses both intrinsic disvalue, undesirable in of itself, and intrinsic normativity, an inherent ought-not status in any context. According to the skeptic's argument, the existence of such a true evil would indeed contradict divine goodness, as it would be an evil that God could neither justify nor redeem within a greater purpose. Conversely, an evil that has a teleological arc, even if it possesses intrinsic disvalue, lacks intrinsic normativity because it serves a purpose that aligns it with an ultimate good. One way to understand this concept is through the lens of art. Artists often incorporate unattractive elements or kinds of aesthetic evils into their work, which, when viewed within the context of the entire artwork, contribute to the beauty of a larger piece. Similarly, in a theistic framework, certain evils, though undesirable in isolation, serve as bigger parts of a larger art piece in which each element including the bad parts, contributes to the overall goodness and coherence of the divine plan. And in this way, the existence of intrinsic disvalue does not automatically entail that it ought not occur, provided it contributes to a meaningful trajectory toward a greater good. And by failing to consider the teleological arc, the skeptic's argument presumes that any allowance of evil must be intrinsically incompatible with divine goodness. However, if each instance of evil is seen as part of a larger narrative that leads to a redeeming purpose, then its presence does not contradict the attributes of an omnibenevolent God. So the teleological framework shifts the focus from evaluating individual evils in isolation to understanding how each might fit within an overarching plan, thus providing a deeper alignment between divine goodness and the existence of evil. Consequently, the skeptic's conflation of intrinsic disvalue with an ultimate ought-not status misses the theistic view that evils like bad parts in a painting can contribute to the beauty of the whole. An evil that contributes to a teleological arc toward the good is thus justified within a theistic framework, where an evil that lacks such a trajectory would indeed challenge the compatibility of divine goodness with its occurrence. Our critique of the skeptic's argument has focused on dismantling key assumptions that underpin it, revealing its incompatibility with the flexibility inherent in many theistic frameworks. Let's revisit the core assumptions and objections we've examined. First is the necessity condition. The skeptic's reliance on the necessity condition implies that every instance of evil must be strictly indispensable for achieving the best possible outcome for God to permit it. And we countered this with the defeat condition, which allows for certain evils to exist as long as they are ultimately defeated or in principle defeasible or redeemable within a grander eschatological narrative. Second is deontological constraints. The argument assumes that divine ethics must operate under rigid deontological rules, overlooking the flexibility in theistic ethics that often incorporates elements of virtue ethics and relational goods. And this broader ethical scope allows for the coexistence of certain evils with divine goodness when they contribute to human or spiritual development. Third is intrinsic goodness of a permitted evil. By asserting that permitted evils must be pro toto good, that is, justified in an absolute sense, the skeptic overlooks that theism permits evils that retain intrinsic disvalue but are permissible for their instrumental roles in the divine plan. Many theistic views distinguish between intrinsic badness and the ultimate purpose these evils may serve. Fourth is the existence of pro toto evils. The argument's reliance on the concept of pro toto evils assumes the existence of evils that, all things considered, ought never to occur. However, within a theistic framework that holds to the defeat condition, such irredeemable or untransformable evils do not exist, as all evils are ultimately defeasible or redeemable within a divinely ordered world. Fifth, world creation as staged processes. The skeptic presumes that a morally perfect God would create a perfectly completed world from the beginning, excluding any disvalue, and the disjunctive creation model offers a counterpoint by showing how God may instantiate a world that allows for free creaturely participation in shaping reality. Initial disvalues, therefore, are not contrary to divine goodness, but are essential to a process-oriented relational creation. Next, we have objections to the argument's internal logic. First is the equivocation on moral status. The argument conflates intrinsic disvalue with intrinsic normativity, assuming that intrinsic badness alone necessitates prevention. And by clarifying that certain evils can be tolerated for their instrumental roles, we highlight that logical missteps in equating intrinsic value with moral impermissibility, which takes us to the next objection, intrinsic versus instrumental value. The argument's failure to differentiate intrinsic from instrumental good weakens its force. And lastly, the teleological flexibility in theism. Finally, the skeptic's interpretation of divine ethics as inflexible misses the dynamic, purpose-driven orientation in theistic ethics. Many theistic perspectives prioritize long-term redemptive arcs, allowing for the integration of short-term disvalues into a teleologically coherent divine plan. And so in summary, the skeptic's argument rests on many assumptions that, upon closer inspection, impose undue constraints on divine action and moral justification within theism. The problem of evil, while significant, does not present an insurmountable challenge to a coherent theistic worldview, when properly considering these nuanced ethical and philosophical distinctions. Together, all of these assumptions we've identified and the objections we've raised reveal that the skeptic's argument, rather than serving as a definitive critique of theism, misinterprets the core of theistic ethics and nature of value within divine reality. The critique underscores that the problem of evil, while challenging, does not provide an insurmountable objection to a coherent theistic worldview. As we conclude today's discussion, I want to remind you that at Exploring Reality, our mission is powered by individuals like you. Your support enables us to continue creating content that challenges, inspires, and equips people in their faith journey. It also opens doors for us to engage with diverse audiences in churches, universities, and other key spaces, making a real impact by spreading truth where it matters the most. If you found this video valuable, we invite you to become a partner in our mission. Your contributions and your donations make this work possible. Visit our website to join our community of supporters and help us continue this vital work.